Hello and welcome to this part 3 of our Tech Talk series. My name is Larry Vavro. I'm a pre-sales engineer here at Ignite, and today we're going to focus on the logs and analytics part of ScaleArc. We have a pretty packed agenda for today. Initially, at the start, I'm going to talk a little bit about how ScaleArc fits into this logging, what data can it collect, what can we look at it, what can we figure out from it from a high-level perspective. And then I'm going to do a little a short demo on how can we actually see what are the screens that we're looking at, what is the data that is displayed in those screens, how can we drill and dig through the log files to see to analyze troubleshoot issues and see what is going on within our database, within Scalar instance, within this protocol, the kind of communication between the application and the database. And then after we go through over those details, we're going to jump over into another section of ScaleArc, which is the analytics. And within these sections, we're going to look at a little bit more structured way of looking at this data, a little bit of what can we see, what can we read from the graphs, how can we perhaps understand a little bit more about this data, about its context and what is happening. Because of course measurements are only worth if they are in some sort of a context, so we can actually interpret them correctly. And as the last point on the agenda, I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of settings and fine tuning and kind of complementary functionalities to logging within ScaleArc. What else can you do? And just bear in mind, just to remember that those are the options. And whenever you need any of those options, just to have it in the back of your head, to make sure you're familiar with that. And at the end of the session, if you have any questions, please do submit them in a chat box, and I'll try to address as many as there will be towards the end of the session. So first of all, why do we need logs and analytics? What do we want to monitor? What do we want to see in the logs? Just so we know what we're talking about here. So, first and foremost, the critical part of logs is monitoring of the health of the system. So we need to understand what is going on within our system, what is happening, and what is the overall health of the system. Those are the critical reasons why we would want to implement logs, implement monitoring tools, dashboards, and all of those technologies. Now, with those tools, we can actually leverage them to like, once we know what is the health of our system, we can actually detect problems early. We can troubleshoot perhaps the issues that we're experiencing, and we can also identify the bottlenecks. So those are the kind of main goals of what the analytics and logs in the kind of this database universe of ScaleArc, which is sitting between the application and the database. They're critical and they're the most important. Now, I have one more point here, and it's perhaps a little bit less popular feature to use your logs and analytics for, but it's actually a very useful one. So the logs in ScaleArc can be very verbose. And by verbose, I mean they can contain a lot of data on the actual queries, on the actual what is going on within the database. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that during the demo, but essentially those logs can perhaps replace your current trigger-based auditing on your tables. If you want to investigate all the inserts, updates on the table, perhaps you no longer need to implement your triggers. Perhaps you can do it this way, and in this way it's a little bit more transparent, but also it would improve your performance of your actual and simplify your architecture of your database. So in that extent, this is just good to remember that this can be leveraged. And if you find that you have a requirement for keeping an audit of all the queries that are being executed against your tables, bear in mind you can achieve that with ScaleArc. The next, so what are we looking for when you have all of this data within the log files? What are the most common things that we're looking for in this data? And I think the most common things are obviously the performance metrics, the measurements, and those kind of all of those details, trends perhaps, and in the context of capacity planning, we might want to see if there is a gradual, constant degradation of performance, perhaps, or increase in the amount of queries being executed, or perhaps there is some to identify potential hardware issues. Also to identify the queries that are perhaps slow, or maybe they're too frequent, or maybe they're just so frequent that perhaps they should be subjected to caching or some other technology, or perhaps they're referencing some non-existent objects or non-existent store procedures, so we can pick up those errors, those kind of things. We can also look for within those log files, because bear in mind, log files in ScaleArc refer to the actual database. They're not only about ScaleArc. They're actually about the communication, what's happening between the database and application. And in the context of performance, as I mentioned before, all the data is worth nothing without context, without something to compare it against. We can have a measurement, how many queries do we run, or how frequently they're being run, or how much time they're being executed within the server. But if we don't have anything to compare it against, it's not very meaningful. So actually, ScaleArc provides you with some tools that you can leverage that to see has there been a performance degradation, perhaps after a release that happened on over the weekend, and you can compare data this Monday to last Monday. So all of those are the kind of measurements that you would want ScaleArc to leverage ScaleArc to look at. So with no further ado, I guess the first part that I want to dig into is the live monitoring sections and the raw log file sections, and also a little bit of historical stats. But in general, those are the kind of the most common views for the data that you would perhaps, as a DBA or as an application developer, you might want to be looking at. So I have a Scalar clusters defined in here, and I have two clusters here within my ScaleArc. One is Aurora's cluster, the other one is always on SQL Server cluster with 3 servers in it. There's some traffic running against this cluster. So to see what is actually happening, to see the live data, I can view it on the different levels of granularity. I can jump in straight into my cluster stats over here. But first, what I want to show is the server stats. So from our menu over here, we can jump over to a server stats screen in which we can see the actual utilization of our server. So we can see the things like CPU usage, bandwidth usage, how much cache do we leverage across all of our clusters, and also how many client server connections. Again, those are details. Those are server ScaleArc level details across all of the clusters, and also the amount of queries that are being executed. So this is super useful, but perhaps we want sometimes a little bit more granular data. Now, bear in mind one thing to note: this CPU usage here is actually per process. On level per actual process. So you can actually see a split, how much CPU is spent load balancing queries versus how much CPU is being used on caching. So this is very detailed, useful information, and you can see it here straight away as live as it happens. So perhaps if you have a call from a support team escalating some issue, this would probably be perhaps the first place to go to see, well, maybe there is a spike in the client server connections, or maybe there's something else going on. This would probably be the first screen you would look at. So I've mentioned that we might want to look at this data in a little bit more granular level. So let's say we want to see only for one of our clusters, so our always on cluster. What we see here is essentially very similar data. Of course, we don't see a CPU usage, but as it's a server level information, but we can still see a client server connections, cache usage, queries per second, cache hit rate, and all of those details over on those graphs. And this is on cluster level. So this is exact measurement of 1,500 records, about 1,500 queries being executed against this cluster every second. And we can even see what is the breakdown of those queries per each server. So we can see that most of the queries, and as a matter of fact, if I jump over to this graph of my cache hit rate, I can see that this is 71% of my queries are being handled within cache. So they don't even go into a SQL Server. But the remaining queries, if I switch off this for a second just to see it a little bit more kind of a verbose view, I can see that most of our queries are handled by my MySQL Slave 1 server, then a little bit less MySQL Slave 2, and then the least amount is MySQL Master. And the reason why MySQL Master serves some less queries is because ScaleArc, as you might recall from a session about load balancing, ScaleArc favors the read-only nodes in terms of read-only traffic. So to leave a little bit of additional capacity, spare capacity on the MySQL on the master node for any writes that perhaps might be coming into the server. And one other thing in here, and this is a very good example of how can you spot an issue. So straight away we see that MySQL MS SQL Slave 2 serves a little bit less queries than MS SQL Slave 1, and this is interesting. Why would that be? And if we scroll further down here, we can see that in average response time per server, MS SQL Slave 2 has a little bit slower response time, as opposed to 450 microseconds. It's more in the region of 630. So this would explain why ScaleArc would decide to route a little bit less traffic. Now, what doesn't explain is why is it a little bit slower. Now, for a fact, I know why is it slower, because this box is a little bit lower spec and a little bit more overloaded with other third-party software. So in that extent, I do have an explanation for it. But this could be a trigger for perhaps a further investigation to understand what is going on there and why is it happening. And in order to kind of see that, you would want to go. You would want to make a decision, maybe log into the server, look at the server then, but at least you know which server is that straight away and what are you looking for. And you can compare it here. So the next section that I want to show you is the historical stats. And the reason why I want to show you this next as after the other section is because it is exactly the same. It is essentially the same, but it allows you to look at the historical stats of your data. So by default, it's showing me CPU usage. I want to jump, let's say, to my queries per second count within this period of time. And what I see in here is that essentially, of course, this is my demo box, so the traffic is on and off. Now, in a real production environment, perhaps you could see the trend here. And you can imagine that if you change your resolution, if you go to a little bit, perhaps a higher level, longer way, you can see those kind of trends whereby the queries might be overall across a week or across 2 weeks might be getting slower and slower. Maybe there is more and more being executed or less and less. All of this kind of analysis on this historical stat screen can be used for this purpose, and this is super useful because you can actually go into every other little bit. You can see your historical lag per server. You can see your system stats. All of this information that you have in the other graphs, you can actually view in here as well. So let me go into another section, which is a log section. And within this section, what I'm going to show you is a little bit more in-depth information about how can you actually dig a little bit deeper. And this is what I often call deep analysis. But essentially what it is just looking at the raw log files. So in here, in this screen, we can see raw log files for this always-on cluster. So you can see that there is a lot of data, a lot of information. We actually have some very specific information, such as the queries that are being executed, including the where clauses, whether they're being served from cache or not from cache, whether they're recognized as reads or writes, whether there's a procedure. All of this information resides in here. You can even enhance this information by checking this box and see a little bit more timing. How does it tie? This is a little bit more kind of debugging data, perhaps, if you wanna understand how much time did it spend on particular parts of the execution. Now, this data might be a little bit overwhelming, and to look at it to find anything useful from this data might sometimes be perhaps a little bit difficult. So in order to do that, you can leverage the filtering functionality. So let's say, and I find this a very, very common approach. I think pretty much each of a user of ScaleArc will do it at some point in time. It's just essentially filtering by a session ID. And the session ID here is basically it's a session ID for the particular client when it connects to ScaleArc. So this is why it will narrow down the data to this logical bit of information for this particular session. And if I filter it out, we can see that right now we have chronological record of all the queries from when the client established a connection. So new client connection received from this particular IP. It hasn't been SSL. There is some connection information extracted using TDS protocol version 74. So this is all super useful information. And then we can see all the queries that are being executed. So we can see that those are all handled by cache. Super useful information. Those are all handled by cache. And if I scroll up, I can see that at this point in time, this query wasn't handled by cache. So all of a sudden, we can see that it has been routed to one of our database servers, and we can see a database IP over here, and then another query and another query, and then it goes until it actually closes in connection. And in this case, it was unexpected. So it seems like this is something perhaps we want to look at some point in time with our application team. I know for a fact that this is I just basically hit the button to kind of disconnect, to abruptly disconnect this connection. So it was torn without, it wasn't graceful. But we can see that due to unexpected external event, this connection has been closed. So even without information from the application server, we can extract this information from over here. On the screen, we also see you can also find a few other details, such as some data from Generalog about our ScaleArc appliance, about the UI and those kind of things. We can also see slow query data. If we would have set a particular threshold, all the queries that are exceeding this threshold would fall down into this log file. We can see also some alerts, and this is a super useful tab that I find I would use a lot, which is a query error log. And the reason for that is perhaps you have a application that is querying objects that has been deleted, name has changed, has been migrated to a different database, or something like that. All of those will be very, very apparent here. And to show you that, let me switch over to my SQL Server Management session, and I have a query here against my ScaleArc demo database that's basically querying object that does not exist. And if I execute this query, let me just reestablish my connection. If I execute this query, of course, I'm getting invalid object name error from the database because the object doesn't exist. But within ScaleArc, as soon as I refresh this view, I see that query. It has just been executed, and I can see invalid object name, object that doesn't exist. So, so this is super useful to kind of make sure that your application is in line with your database, and sometimes those logistics between deployments, when you're in UAT or a QA phase in the lower lane, this is again super useful to figure out have we broke anything. So let me jump back to my presentation for a second. So we went through a system level stats. I showed you how to look at the kind of system level stats, system level granularity. We went to a cluster level. We looked at the historical stats, which is essentially those are three different views for the same data, similar data, slightly different granularity, slightly different perspective in terms of what amount of data or what is the sample size of the data. But in general, those are the kind of live monitoring aspects. And then we did a little bit of a deep dive into the log files, into the analysis of the actual queries. We use the session ID, and I think this is very useful. If you haven't used session ID, you should probably use it, because essentially in some cases when you're trying to narrow down some issue, this is the easiest way. You know which client the connection was coming from. You can find one query, and then by narrowing down this search, by copying and pasting the session ID, you can see exactly what has happened step after step on this connection. So super useful for that purpose. And now I want to move to a little bit more graphical aspect of our analytics, and how can we look at it from a more holistic perspective, from a more generalized perspective. How can we identify the queries? So obviously on log files we can see queries that are slow running. We can see, but we can't really use this data very in a useful way. Of course, we can copy and paste query, figure out where the query ran from, and try to optimize it. But perhaps there is a better way of doing it. Perhaps we can actually generalize those queries, see the overview of them, and this is where the analytics part comes in. And one thing that I want to show before I drill in and then kind of look at the overall queries and then kind of do some comparisons, what I want to ensure is that you are familiar with those two settings here. One is the logs level, and the other one is to ensure that the analytics process is running. Let me jump over to my ScaleArc instance again. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you now where to look for those settings. So we have and I'm going to go in details in those settings at the beginning. Right now, I just want to ensure that you're familiar with how to make be certain that analytics will work flawlessly. So first of all, in this section of settings for logs, and this is per cluster, so you can perhaps enable analytics for one of the clusters but disable it for the other. And this here is the important setting. So if you set your log level to minimal, you will no longer be able to leverage analytics panel, the analytics section of ScaleArc, purely because ScaleArc will stop gathering sufficient information to be able to support this interface. So you need at least extended or verbose mode. And another setting that you need to ensure that it's correctly set is within the system settings here. And this is to ensure that the analytics are actually running. So this button here, since it says stop analytics, it informs you that they're actually running. If it would have said start analytics, that would indicate that they're not running and it needs to be pressed. So so those are the two settings to ensure before we even start doing any analytical work within our cluster, on our SQL, on our queries data. So now I'm going to jump into analytics section here, and it takes a little bit usually to bootstrap because there is quite a lot of information going behind the scenes. And within here, we can see some information about the total amount of queries, and then we can see, let's say we change it to a previous day, perhaps. I think we're just past midnight. Apologies about that. And then within this section, we can see the data for the total amount of queries so that are being executed across a cluster. This is my always-on cluster, which got pretty heavily used over last day, and then there is another cluster that wasn't as heavily used, just barely here, and so this is the first view that we see. Now below that screen, we can see some summary data for our clusters, such as how many queries has been executed, how many server time has they taken from our SQL Server, and how many cache time had they spent actually querying the data from cache, from within the cache, and how much time this cache actually saved. And then there is some data about how many reads, how many writes have been executed against those databases. So from this section here, we can actually drill into and see more details. So perhaps if I drill into this 11 p.m. hour, I can see the actual split against which databases have the queries been run. And since I have one database, ScaleArc Demo 1, all the queries were run against this database. There is a few 108 queries being run against the master database, not too many. So a little bit more detailed information we can obtain. If I hover over this row, I can see actually which databases have handled most queries, and then which what were the whether there were read or writes. Now in my case, it was pretty much 100% read traffic, and then some overall statistical information about what is the average and minimum maximum for the server and cache. So this is the first level of information. But in order to perform analytics, we want to drill in further. So I'm going to drill into here, and this is perhaps the most useful screen of all the analytics section of ScaleArc. What we can see here, we can actually see a generalized queries. So ScaleArc is able to recognize similar queries, generate patterns for them, and group them into the sections. So in this case, it generalized that this query that matches this pattern has been run nearly 500,000 times with a cache hit rate of 99%, and then some statistical information in here. And this query I have cached before, therefore it appears over here. It's actually the most frequently run query. It also has been the slowest running query in this pink region. Now, perhaps we want to look at those as the next stage. So if I zoom into this section, of course, I can see a little bit more detailed analysis, detailed kind of a graph knowledge about this on this diagram of which queries perhaps might be cached. I can go in and see and start caching, but I'm not going to be doing caching now. What I want to do, I want to actually see how does this compare against a different hour of the day. How does what's happening in this database? So the next part that I want to show you here is to compare patterns. This is super useful part of analytics that perhaps is a little bit hidden away, because it's not selected from the menu. It's not within those filters that are pretty obvious and noticeable. This is the button that you can click over when you're on this view, and then what ScaleArc will do, it will pick all the patterns from within this period of time and run it against, by default, it runs it against a previous hour in time. So let's say I'm going to go a little bit further to 9 p.m. Let's see what happens there. Yeah, so we can see that side by side, we have a same pattern against one database and against the same database within one period of time and the second period of time. So in here we can see that within this hour we have actually had a little bit less traffic than within the previous hour, and we've seen it on the corresponds to the first graph that we've seen. We've seen a huge peak there as the traffic was peaking. But also the super useful information here is that for a fact, I know that somewhere around 8 p.m. perhaps, I've been playing with the cache. So we can see here that at this point in time, only 11% of the queries were getting cache hit rate, as opposed to 99% within the most recent traffic. And you can see straight away here this difference of 5 hours versus 2 seconds. Of course, there is a difference between the amount of queries, but even still, this is quite significant. Perhaps it's a tenfold difference in here, but this difference is huge. So those kind of comparisons can give us some baseline. So obviously we would pick if we run the release over the weekend and Monday come into work, we want to run a comparison against previous Monday, perhaps. Depending on the nature of our application, to see how did it impact. Is there an impact? Is there a performance degradation? Is there a performance improvements? Are there any new queries? You can select. You can only look at the unique queries in time A or time B, and all of those details you can look from this view. It's super useful to have this high level view over what has happened over this period of time against this timeline and this timeline. I found that our users find it very, very useful for a lot of investigations. So this would basically give a good overview of what can be done in analytics sections. There's perhaps few more features here that are worth mentioning, such as, for example, the details of the actual query. So you can get a detailed report and analysis on each of the query patterns. That will basically break you down all the queries by user, by which host they're being executed against. So all of those details can be super useful if you're preparing some reports, or if you're trying to understand a little bit of kind of generalized knowledge around your data and what is going on. And that probably concludes the most. So there's a lot that you can do within this analytics section. Now, those are the functionalities that we find with our customers are mostly used, and they're super, super helpful. So if you have not used that, perhaps you might want to look into that and see maybe there is some queries that you want to that you might want to do some analysis on, do a little bit of detailed reports, or maybe database optimizations, or perhaps just simple create a cache rules, as we did in our tech talk about caching. So let me jump back to my presentation for a second. And so we went through this kind of core settings that are 100% necessary for analytics to operate. We went through a kind of overview of the high-level view of the stats. What can we see from this first views? We drilled into a little bit into details to identify perhaps the queries that might be a subject for optimization, and then we did a little bit of comparison. And again, this comparison. This is a super powerful tool for any kind of analysis against kind of some sort of a baseline that you establish, and this could be leveraged for your continuous kind of improvement. And so the last section that I want to touch base on here before concluding, moving into Q&A, is the kind of settings and fine-tuning. In Scalar, there's few options that you can use for fine-tune. I think logs, perhaps a little less than there is in load balancing aspect, or that we did on the other tech talks. But I think there's still worth keeping in back of your mind, even if you're not using them, or even if you don't use them at this moment, or if you don't find them valuable for you at this very, very moment, you might perhaps leverage those features at some stage. So it's good to be familiar with. So let me jump back into my ScaleArc. And the first setting that I've already mentioned is obviously the logs level, which we have 3 options. And there is a very self-explanatory table here to show you like what is the extra information that you're getting. Now, one other aspect that I haven't mentioned is that I have mentioned actually when I was talking about the logs insights, but this is the threshold that you can set for the slow running queries. So what I found in my experience is that the good approach for this threshold is basically to start from the highest, let's say 10 seconds, and then identify all the queries that are 10 seconds or slower, make sure you can optimize them. And once you get rid of those, then perhaps you want to move to 8 seconds, to 9 seconds, or to 6 seconds, 7 seconds. And then gradually, if you do it on continual basis, you can actually identify a lot of queries that perhaps wouldn't be looked at in a different situation. And another aspect of it is that by optimizing long-running queries, whether you break it down to 2 queries, whether you add additional indices, or perhaps just basically it will require some restructuring of your tables or something like that. By doing that, you're actually optimizing your database for much less locking on the I/O, on the table, on the resources side. So all the long running queries usually would lock some resources for a period of time. So that introduces obviously the delay. It impacts all the other queries that are running against the database as well. So you want to minimize this impact. You want this sharing of those resources to happen as much as possible, rather than one query locking it for a long time. So this is how you can achieve that, just basically utilizing this slow query. Now, another part of this settings is on screen logs backup here. So essentially what that screen allows you is to set your FTP server that you can upload periodically. You can do it every hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, your log files to the backup server. And this is, I've already mentioned the audit purposes. So this is one of the reasons why you might want to do that. You might want to do it for other reasons. Of course, your FTP can be pointing at whatever the service that you want to. It could be the cheap storage. So you can actually ship logs off your main server and then into S3 or some other storage that is blob storage in Azure or something like that, something cheaper for storing this data, leveraging FTP protocol. And then another section here is for our archive, and this is by default, I think it's 3 here, and it's on. Essentially, what that means that after 3 days, your logs will be just basically compressed to save hard drive space. Now, obviously, that limits the way you can manipulate them and interact with them. So perhaps if you find that you want to look at some older data and it's being slow, or something gets impacted because of it, you might want to memorize this option and increase it to your value, or decrease it if you're struggling with hard drive space. Another option, maybe a little bit less related to logging directly, although it does impact logging. It's more general option in the caster settings on the ScaleArc tab. And this is a maximum query logging length setting. And this is a setting that is worth mentioning for the reason that sometimes, depending on the way the application is written, some queries can be very long. They can be CTA statements, there can be subqueries, a lot of joins, a lot of filters, and all of those can sum up to over the default 2,000 characters limit. And what ScaleArc would do then, it will trim the query to this length when logging. So if you find that you want this value to be changed, you want this fine-tuned to match your application, this is where you would look at it, essentially as simple as changing this number here. And then a few other, maybe not so much settings, but 2 other functions that are very useful in the context of log files are, first is the file browser feature. And it might be a little bit counterintuitive that file browser is actually useful for logging. But what you can do here, you can actually browse your file system on your ScaleArc appliance. What that allows you to do, it allows you to actually go into a particular folder and actually download all the data for this particular log, or whatever you want to look at here. So for example, if I want to look at my always on, I remember that the ID is 19. I can go into here. I can see all my alerts, all the data in the raw format without any formatting. I can even view it on the by server and by database. So all of this is super useful here if you wanna dive a little bit deeper. Perhaps you want to run your more sophisticated analytic script. Perhaps you have a regular expression that you want to execute against this, and your query exceeds the possibilities of the UI in terms of what do you want to achieve with analysis. Or maybe you want to just import it to Excel and look at it from this aspect. This can be done from over here. And the last thing I want to show is on the settings screen, there is an alerting section. And in here, what you can actually do, you can per cluster, you can set up your email addresses to send an email every time there is some sort of issue going on with the server. And this could be a distribution group or something like that. And you can do it on per cluster basis. So if you have various applications running against the same ScaleArc instance, this is exactly what you would do. You would basically set up separate email addresses or separate application owners here for per cluster, and then send them email every time there is some sort of issue going on. So this is where you would set this up. So that would essentially conclude my presentation, my demo part of this session. We went through this kind of different log levels. We went through how to set up and how to use the kind of slow queries classification for the continuous improvement, perhaps, or for some other reason. And then how can you back up your logs and a few other settings, and also how can you access them in the raw format and set up the email alerts. So I'd like to thank you for the time you spent with me listening to this session today. I hope you find useful information in it that you can leverage to help you with your ScaleArc use. And right now, let's see if there are any questions, Susan.
Thanks, Larry. We did actually get a few questions in, but they are account specific, so we'll follow up with those individuals separately. As a reminder, we still have 2 Tech Talks remaining in our series. When we meet next, we'll discuss how to ensure zero downtime during planned and unplanned outages. On behalf of Ignite Technologies, thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.